what makes getting along non-obvious?
Oh, good question. I had not prepped for this. Um, I think in some ways it's actually quite obvious in that we expect to get along. I think what's non-obvious about it is how surprised we are when it doesn't happen. Like I think we're often so taken aback by the idea that our relationships at work fracture or are tense or don't, because we do just presume, well, why can't we just get along?
What makes someone remarkable? Is the college application process fair? Do you mind being described as the white people whisperer? What is the optimal age to get married?
You start to find the non-obvious way kind of works.
Is there like a cartoonist community?
That year was the first year that we ever heard a teacher talk about race.
So many times when we go live with these things, it's like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, boom.
Boom.
Welcome to the Non-Obvious Book Review. I am your host, Rohit Bhargava, and I'm so excited to be talking with Amy Gallo, who is an amazing author. She is a contributing editor to the Harvard Business Review, and she has a book called Getting Along: How to Work with Difficult People. And she's not a difficult person, which is great, but she's going to teach us all about how to deal with difficult people. So, Amy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Rohit. And I have to say, I haven't been a difficult person to you, but you never know.
Well, you write about this idea because we've all experienced it. And one of the things that you wrote early on in the book, which I really found deeply helpful, was this sense that we think we are people in many cases, and we assume that we know how to deal with difficult people. Right. And sometimes that assumption isn't quite correct. So I'd love to start there because you talk about how people turn towards their instincts when it comes to finding someone who is difficult and how that might not be the right way to go. So talk a little bit about the instinct required to deal with difficult people and whether we have it or we don't, or what else we might want to turn to instead of that.
Yeah. I mean, it's such an interesting conundrum because we've grown up presumably interacting with people our whole lives, right? Friends, families, teachers, right? Roommates. And we think, oh yeah, I know how to deal with people. And certainly you've probably navigated cringy, awkward, tense moments with all of those people, maybe even some outright disagreements. And so when we get into the workplace and we're dealing with someone who pushes our buttons, we're like, why can't I do this? Like, why is this keeping me up at night? Or why does it seem like everything I do makes things worse instead of better? And the reality is that our brains just aren't set up to handle situations in which there's a fracture in our relationship because we experience that as a threat. We experience it as a threat to harmony, a threat to our relationship, maybe a threat to our identity or ego, maybe even a threat to our career. And when we're under threat, our brain's biggest message is protect, protect, protect. And the thing you need to do in order to get along with someone you found challenging is yes, you need to protect yourself, but you also need to be open-minded. You need to be collaborative. You need to be empathetic, none of which is natural when we are feeling threatened. Emotional intelligence experts call that amygdala hijack. Most people know it as fight, flight, or freeze, right? It's just that moment where our prefrontal cortex isn't operating at its maximum capacity, and instead our amygdala is taking over and really trying to control the situation.
Well, and one of the things you write about is that we have an assumption that we make sometimes in our head when our mind and our brains are in that mode of assuming that all difficult people are just jerks. Right. And you talk about how that's not actually the case. And you define these 8 archetypes of difficult people. And I thought that was a really interesting way of breaking it down. And I'm curious, as you tell us about some of those archetypes,
sure,
how did you identify those and come to, I'm always curious when somebody has 8, for example, like how did you land on those 8?
Yeah. Well, it could have been like 45 to be fair, right? There are many flavors of challenging coworker.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of books in this area just treat them as difficult coworkers or as jerks. And I think that there's a lot of good advice in the books that address people as that monolith. But what I really understood from my role at HBR and interacting with some of the research that had been done is that there was really evidence-based advice that was specific to the patterns of behavior someone might be dealing with. And that's why I went with the archetypes, is I wanted to deliver that sort of more custom advice based on exactly who you're dealing with. Now, 8 is, I have to say, it's a little bit random. It was a process of thinking through the questions I've been asked as I talk about conflict, looking at the research, doing some surveys with my LinkedIn audience, as well as some other surveys, just trying to understand what are the most common patterns of behavior or archetypes that people were encountering. There's certainly ones that I haven't covered. It's not a mutually exclusive list. But the 8 I landed on were the ones that I understood to be what people were struggling with most, and which I knew I had advice for. And that was the key. I didn't want to cover an archetype that I was like, best of luck, nothing to say here. Right.
I mean, I have to ask, are there archetypes like that? I mean, are there people where it's just like, you have to just give up?
Yeah. I mean, I think the true narcissist, we love to throw around the term narcissist that we work with someone, but true narcissists, which is a very small part of our population, we definitely have people who are overly confident. We have people who are self-centered, but true narcissists, I think, are really challenging to deal with. And I think much of what you try to do in terms of my line of advice, in terms of being empathetic, trying to be collaborative, open-minded, just does not work. You have to be very tactical, and often you have to leave the situation to deal with them or not deal with them. Also, obviously, psychopaths, anyone who would fall into that category. I tried to stay away from things that had a real, true psychological diagnosis because I'm not a psychologist, and I do think you need often professional help. Some of the archetypes like the insecure boss, the tormentor, do engage a little bit in bullying, but I also stayed away from the true bullies because I think that's another one. There is advice about how to deal with them, and that's helpful, but more often than not, again, it's about removing yourself from that situation.
Yeah, and you do say that we throw these terms around in many cases. Oh, my boss is such a narcissist, but actually, I mean, they're not a narcissist in the truest sense of the diagnosis of that word. We just sort of throw them around. So that was an important distinguishing factor. One of the archetypes you did write about, though, was that really stood out for me was the pessimist, because in general in life, I'm pretty optimistic. And then my latest book is very optimistic about the future. And the big question that I get all the time is, look, man, don't you see the wildfires that are happening, or like all of these things that are going on? Like, how can you be so optimistic about the future? So I personally deal with pessimists a lot. And I'm curious about your advice on how to deal with pessimists specifically.
Yeah. It's funny. I was talking to my niece the other day and she said, yeah, I really identify as a pessimist. And I said, why? And she said, because the world, and I was like, yeah, it's very rational in today's world to be pessimistic.
Yeah.
And yet I think it's really frustrating when you are optimistic like you are, and you look for the opportunities, I mean, it's certainly in all your work, I see that become very clear.
Thank you.
It's frustrating to deal with someone who's like, nope, things are going horribly. Nothing's going to go right. This will fail.
And there are people like that. I mean, there are
Yeah.
people whose default personality is just, that's what it is.
Yeah. And it's some, we could get into the whole nature versus nurture conversation about it, but I think that's not helpful. I think more important to understand is there's actually a social psychology concept called motivational focus. Like, what motivates you? What's your focus for motivating you? There's prevention focused people. Those are our pessimists who are really focused on averting disaster, avoiding downsides to things, really preventing risks from coming true. It's just sort of a tendency for them. And then you have promotion focused people, which you would fall into that category, right? And people who look for the opportunities, they tend to actually be trend spotters often because they're really focused on the future. And not to say that trend spotters are all optimistic. I'm sure there's you can
They aren't
That's
universally,
right.
but it is a personality type. I mean, if you're looking towards the future, a lot of times you do try and present a possible future that would be better.
Yeah. And the thing is, most of us work in cultures that value optimism, right? That really, and to the point that often we have toxic positivity, which is that if you're not optimistic, if you're not future focused, if you're not hopeful, you're seen as a naysayer or a rabble rouser or just a downer, right? Like how many terms do we have for that pessimist, like Debbie Downer, agony aunt, right? Like there's all these terms. And the reality is we all have moments when we're pessimistic. I mean, if I haven't
Yeah.
slept and I'm hungry and things aren't going my way, I'm going to be pessimistic. And it's the challenge is when it's a regular pattern of behavior and it inhibits a team from collaborating or achieving their goals because it silences people, because one of the interesting pieces of research about this is people who are contrarian or seen as naysayers tend to have more power in a group discussion, because if everyone's sort of coalescing around an idea that's more positive and they're like, oh, but wait, right, we afford them a greater amount of power and
Yeah.
influence in that conversation.
Well, and brainstorm theory often does say that those are the people who kind of sit back, and when they do start to criticize, they end up bringing the group to a better idea, a better dynamic. So sometimes you
right.
do need that type of personality
Well,
inside of a meeting like a brainstorm.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I got excited. But
Yeah.
they play such an important role. I mean, you and I could probably list 12 corporate scandals right now that would have been avoided had they actually heeded the caution of the pessimists, right? Like there's
Yeah.
often, and I think we have to be careful that we're not silencing them, that we're actually engaging with them. And some of the tactics I share in the book is, one, don't polarize, like you're negative, I'm positive, you're a pessimist, I'm an optimist. Because truth is, pessimists think optimists are naive, like misinformed.
Right.
And the more you insist on positivity, the more they're going to insist on negativity. So you got to watch for that polarizing. You also want to make sure that you're granting them their premise, this communication tool, where you say, I see where you're coming from. You don't have to agree with them, right?
Empathize.
Or sympathize, or even it just sort of validate that their view isn't ridiculous. And I think even saying part of me agrees that there are big risks with this, but another part of me thinks we can overcome those risks if we are careful. Let's talk about how to do that, right? And I think engaging them as opposed to dismissing them is much better, not only for your relationship with them, but for the organization, for the team, because then you actually get to hear out those potential risks, the downsides, the things you might be missing because you're so positive about how this is going to play out. Then you can actually react to them.
One of the stories that you shared early in the book was being an editor at a publication, receiving an email from someone who thought that they might have something to contribute there. And you
good
sort of
old
got back
Brad.
to them very quickly. Yeah, it's Brad, exactly, as you called him. And he was short and sort of rude in his email back. And you did what probably most people would do eventually, which is they're like, oh, I'll just delete it. But deleting it didn't stop you from thinking about it. And you kind of played it over and over in our head. And I found that such a human reaction, because I would do exactly the same thing. And what it led you to was, I think, one of the big ideas in the book. And it's one of the great things that I really liked about the book is that it's so tactical. That really gives you these ideas for what to do. And the big idea that you introduced in that part, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, was interpersonal resilience.
Yes.
This idea that you can get over stuff and teach yourself how to get over it instead of just dwelling on it, even though you already deleted the email. So what is interpersonal resilience?
Yeah, it is the notion that you are more confident going into challenging interactions. So maybe you are dealing with that pessimist, and you, instead of waking up in the morning, go, oh my God, I have a meeting with them, right? You can feel like, okay, I have the confidence. I know how to interact with them. It may not always go well, but I have the skills I need. And the feeling that when you're in the midst of that interaction, you're not feeling um, as much stress and anxiety as you would feel, but you can sort of stay out of that amygdala hijack and stay present in the conversation enough to be able to pull back and say, okay, I know what's happening here. Let me see if I can change this dynamic. Or, ooh, I notice I'm actually starting to respond, in reaction to them. Let me see if I can reconnect with who I really want to be in this moment. It's the ability to just be resilient in the face of these real serious interpersonal challenges. I mean, the story with Brad, I think about that sometimes. It was an email I got in the fall, I think it was fall of 2020. I probably got 300 other emails that day, but I can tell you verbatim what Brad said because it was so disturbing to me. And because of our natural negativity bias, right? Of course, I'm not going to I can remember lines from a negative performance review from 2002, but I can't tell you the compliment someone gave me last week because we're just so focused on the negative stuff. And it's just human tendency. Again, it's part of that sort of way of protecting ourselves, protecting our egos. But we need to not let the Brads of the world get under our skin to the point that I lost 3 nights of sleep over that one email. Like,
Yeah.
this was someone who I had no relationship with. Like, we had interacted like 5 times. That's just not okay. It's human. Let me just say that.
Mhm.
It's normal, but it's not how I want. I want to be more resilient in the face of those interactions.
Yeah, one of the tactical ideas you shared, which I thought was so insightful, was keeping a compliments folder as a way of dealing with that. So talk about what a compliments folder is.
Yeah, and a complex folder, no matter who you're dealing with, I think it's really helpful for some of the archetypes. Certainly, an insecure boss, anyone who would really get under your skin and make you question yourself. But a compliments folder is just a folder in your email where anytime you get a compliment, you put it in that folder, and then over time, you accumulate all of these positive things that if you're having a tough day, if you do get an email from a Brad, you can go and look at those compliments and remind yourself, no, this is who I am. This is who I am at my best. This is how I want to be in the world. I don't need to get deep into this like 75 email passive aggressive like ridiculousness with my know-it-all colleague, right? I
Yeah.
can remember who I want to be. To be honest, I actually have, because I have 2 different email accounts. I have compliments folders in both, and I don't look at them that often. It's knowing it's there is enough of a bolster. Sometimes I'll go in and scan a few, and it does make me feel so good. But the other way that I advise people to use it is if you have to interact with someone who you find challenging, read some before you go into that interaction, then read a few when you come out. And that, again, will help to develop that resilience of like, this interaction doesn't determine who I am or how capable I am at interacting with other humans.
Mm.
This is just a moment in time.
It strikes me that some of the tactics you write about are trying to make dealing with difficult people more strategic and less emotional, in the sense of being able to prepare for it ahead of time and have these tactics that you can use. And one of the I guess it's a tactic, but really more of a suggestion was knowing your goal beforehand. And there was a story you told of someone. I usually don't like this, by the way, in books when people are like, well, I'll call this person such and such, and they just make up a name.
Yeah.
But in your book, it really worked because it didn't remove me from it being a real situation.
Good.
And I thought that you did that really nicely. And one of the stories that you talked about was someone, I don't recall the name you gave this person, but they would always get talked over in presentations and they found it to be really frustrating. And ultimately, they used one of the tactics that you shared, and the person who was talking over them did it less. But what was interesting about that story to me wasn't so much that, it was that what she really wanted was an apology that she never got.
Mm-hmm.
And what I thought was so interesting about that is, it worked because the situation that bothered her at work became better but she didn't get the apology. It wasn't like this big Hollywood, like, oh, I'm so sorry, I realized I was wrong. It's because sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's just you fix the behavior to be a little better, but you're never going to get the apology.
Yeah.
And I thought that was realistic in a way that felt really true to me.
Yeah. And I think knowing what you want from the situation, like, what does your emotional self want, right? Like in that case, she wanted an apology. Like, and I get that. I want an apology when I'm
Yeah,
mistreated too,
totally.
right?
Totally.
But what is it you actually need in order to move forward? Because the reality is you don't show up to your passive aggressive colleague, point out one time that they said one thing and did the other, or that they said they were fine when they weren't fine. And they go, oh my gosh, I'm passive aggressive. I'm going to change that. And then none of it ever works that way. And in fact, some of my most successful interactions with difficult colleagues have been ones that went terribly in the moment. There were tears, there was yelling, there was like, and then, but it broke open the dynamic in a way that allowed it slowly to change over time. And I think that story you're referring to in the book is about what is it you actually need, right? I probably am not going to get this guy to stop interrupting me every single time because he seems incapable of that. But can I do it? Can I lessen it enough? Can we change the dynamic enough that it happens less and that I feel more resilient in the moments that it does happen? Now, believe me, I would like to make sure that guy never does that. It's not appropriate. It can be really damaging to team culture, to the dynamic in a room, to a meeting. But I think if your goal is perfection, especially when it comes to human interaction, you're gonna fail, right? It's not gonna happen. So you have to really figure out what are the things that you can make progress on. And really, even if it's the tiniest win. I remember I had a pessimistic colleague where my goal was just to get them to smile once a day. And that was it. And seeing them smile was like, okay, like it's small things, just that, and again, not the goal is to like have everyone smile at work, but it just was like small victories of I could connect with this person in a way that felt a tiny bit more positive. I did want to say about the names in the book. I really wanted real stories. It's just so hard to get people to agree to tell their worst difficult colleague story with actually using their real name and details. So yes, I agree. I have the same reaction when people are like, I'm going to call him Tom. I'm like, does Tom really exist? I guarantee all those people really exist. Those are all.
I think that's why it worked, because it was clear that they did really exist, and it was pretty obvious why they wouldn't want their real names to be used. So I thought it worked for that reason. It's not like a lot of times it's like a B2B book, which is like a company that works in this industry. And you're like, did you just make up this company? I mean, is this really a company?
That's right. I'm that skeptical reader too. I was like, okay, right. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, the book was filled with some great, and I say this with a lot of respect, one-liners. Right. And I am a big fan of those because they stick out for people. People remember those. And one of them that stuck out for me is when you wrote that we conflate competence with confidence. What does that mean?
Yeah. This is the know-it-all chapter. I will admit the know-it-all chapter was the hardest to write because it is the archetype I identify most with. And when I think about like the feedback I've gotten over my career, a lot of it is like, what your tone can be condescending. You clearly think you're the smartest person in the room. Like, I'm like, oh gosh. So writing that chapter was a little like, oh gosh, can I I felt like I was giving advice to everyone in my life. But the confidence and competence is actually a lot pulled from the work of Tomás Chamorro-Premuzic, who wrote an HBR article, one of the most popular articles ever, called "Why Do So Many Incompetent Men Become Leaders?"
It's a book too.
It's right. He's turned it into a book. And I think the real idea there is that we reward overconfidence, especially when we're trying to assess something that we don't have a hard measurement for. So like leadership or even management, right? We don't have a sort of score rubric that we can do for those things. We try to make them, but ultimately we have to rely on people to tell us how good they are at something. And the more they're overconfident, the more we believe that they are competent. And those things aren't always connected. In fact, some of the most competent people I know question their competence a lot. It's actually part of the process of developing skills and mastering a capability or competency, is wondering, am I good at this? How can I get better? And yet we are all over. I mean, it's not just organizations that reward confidence, like society. I mean, all you have to do is look at some of our leaders, right? To know that we just love people who believe they're great. And often we don't require them to prove it. So, I think the overconfidence also tends to be gendered. We know that men tend to feel more overconfident a lot because of the way they're socialized. But it's universal. Like, one of my favorite stats in this area is if you ask people if they're a better than average driver, 75% of people will say yes, which is a statistical impossibility, right? So we just believe we're better at things than we actually are often. And that's unfortunately and results in this know-it-all behavior. And I think it's a really common archetype that people come up against a lot.
Yeah. And what was interesting to me when you were writing about that I didn't realize, I did know the whole thing about the driving and how we tend to overestimate ourselves oftentimes.
Yeah.
What I didn't realize is that behavior from an individual can actually create a workplace culture that is overconfident.
Yes.
And seep into everyone else, which is really interesting, because now it leads you to understand maybe some of the corporate situations that we encounter with companies that inflate what they're able to do, or don't think through the ramifications or the ethics behind the advancements that they're putting out into the world. I mean, it makes sense in that context.
Yeah, that's when you need to invite the pessimists in, right? Is like to counter that overconfidence, because we love it. I mean, we just, and it is, in fact, most of these behaviors and most emotions are contagious. So when someone feels like, oh, this is definitely going to succeed, especially the more power they have in the organization, it's very likely we're just going to go, oh yeah, that will succeed. And then, and we are so quick to silence skeptics because it feels countercultural, that we don't, again, we can point to those dozens of corporate scandals that exactly end up, the background is one of this, these sort of phenomena happening of someone believing erroneously that this is you're going to hit these numbers, and someone else saying, oh yeah, but anyone who disagrees is totally off base. And it's a sort of stew of human instincts and our cognitive biases that just lead to these dangerous situations.
Do you think that part of the solution is having more women in leadership positions?
Well, we do know that women tend to be less overconfident, and we do know that women also tend to have a more humble leadership style. So we'll question things more openly, won't sort of proclaim to have the ideas. As a know-it-all, I'm like, oh, it's not always the case, right? As we know, with all stereotypes.
There's always outliers.
Yeah, exactly. But I do think that is certainly would help. And I think the other thing we know, even just having more diverse teams from a gender perspective, from a racial perspective, from a neurodiversity perspective, one of the things we know about, and that's I'm sure about diverse teams, is they have less confidence about whether they'll succeed in the task, but they tend to succeed more because they actually aren't. They have to question: can we do this? Will there be conflict? Right? It's not. They're not defaulting to the sort of dominant culture of the team that believes that it can actually get done. They have to question, how do we do this? How does everyone play a role? How do we have the capabilities to do this in the room? How do we navigate what will inevitably be conflict? Because we don't all think alike.
Well, we talked a little bit about how tactical the book is. In fact, at the end of the book, you talk about 9 principles for dealing with difficult people. And to close out our conversation, I'd like to ask you about a couple of those in sort of rapid fire method, if we can.
Let's do it. Yeah.
So one of them that I found interesting was you say, avoid gossip mostly. Yes. What does that mean?
So gossip, the research on gossip is really interesting. It definitely plays into our confirmation bias. So if I decide that my colleague is pessimistic, I will be looking for evidence that they are pessimistic. The once I start telling others that they're pessimistic, it becomes even more confirming. So you really want to avoid it. However, there is research that shows that when someone knows they will be gossiped about, they tend to adhere more to the organizational or team norms. So sometimes it can actually be helpful, and I'm not suggesting people do this, but I want to be clear what the research says is that you can, by having a culture in which people know if they don't adhere to our positive norms, that they'll be gossiped about, can cause them to actually behave better.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Another one you say is know your biases, which strikes me as difficult to do because so many biases are unconscious. So how can we better know our biases?
So one of the ways is you can take like an implicit bias test. There's lots of them available,
Mhm.
just to sort of get to know. The other thing, one of the tactics I offer in that section, and I think is really helpful, is something called flip it to test it, which is that you may not know your biases, but you want to ask yourself, if I'm dealing with this person and I'm convinced they're challenging, I'm convinced they're know-it-all, they're a tormentor, an insecure boss, ask yourself, if they were a different gender, a different race, if they came from a different background, would I feel the same way? Would I judge the behavior in the same way? Because that's one of the dangers anytime we use the label difficult, is sometimes we just mean different. And we have to be really careful that we're not deciding someone's challenging just simply because of who they are.
Hmm. Another one you say is experiment to know what works. And it led me to wondering, what role does experience and perhaps age play in your ability to be able to deal with difficult people?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite of the principles. And the idea is just that you have to try things, see what works, refresh your approaches, try something else, right? Again, this is not perfection. This is a journey of trying to nudge the relationship into a more productive way. Your question about experience is interesting. That a lot of people who've read the book and are more senior, they say, "Oh, I wish I had this when I was younger in my career," because I think they have learned along the way. And it's easier to deal with a know-it-all who talks over you if you've dealt with 5 know-it-alls who talk over you before and you've had success and succeeding despite that. So I think anytime you have experience, and really we know that any sort of resilience, whether it's interpersonal resilience or another type of resilience or even emotional intelligence, we develop by making mistakes, learning from them, and then trying something different. And so
Hmm.
definitely, I think the more experience you have in these areas, the chances that you're going to be more resilient and hopefully be more successful in navigating some of these relationships.
One of the funniest things about business books I find sometimes as I'm reading them is I get to the end and I read the last chapter or close to the last chapter, and I think to myself, some people might want to read this first. And I thought that with your book because the last chapter was sort of about what if it doesn't work? Like, what if all of this fails? And you ask a question there, which is, should I quit? How
Mhm.
does someone answer that?
Oh, I get asked this one all the time, and unfortunately, I mean, certainly in interviews, but I get asked it by people. Like they tell me their story, and they're like, "Should I quit?" And it's so hard to answer.
Yeah.
I think I have the ultimate "it depends" answer, which is so unsatisfying. But I do think you have to think about one. Let me say two things. I think quitting is an overrated option in that I think oftentimes we think, well, I'm going to get out of here and go to a place that will value me and I'll have all positive relationships. And I think that's naive. Like you're going to have difficult relationships no matter where you work. It's rare to find people who don't say they have at least one annoying coworker. Um, it's also an underrated option in that I think people think they should stick it out. Like I'm just gonna things will change. It's not that bad. And then before they know it, they're sleepless nights, they're sick, they're experiencing a lot of stress. So I think it's really a matter of asking yourself a few questions of like how impactful is the stress on me and my life, right? Is it taking up so much time and energy that I'm not able to do my job or live my life or be a good family member or whatever it is? Um, Hopefully the answer is no, right? But if it is, that's a good sign you need to quit. Two, like the other question I think is, do you have another option? Like, are there other places you can go that can, and chances are you do, it just might take some time to develop them. And along those lines, what I really often tell those people who say, here's my situation, should I quit? I'll say, okay, set a goal, 3 months, and just pick 2 small things that you need to change in those 3 months or 6 months. And if you aren't, sleeping well, if this person hasn't stopped undermining you, if you haven't been able to get the support of your other colleagues, okay, then it's time, brush up your resume. But the thing that really upsets me is when I hear these stories of people who stuck it out for years and years in a place that just clearly wasn't healthy for them. And I think that's unfortunately only a question an individual can answer.
Well, I think the best way to close would be to maybe ask you a question that is sort of on brand for this show about being non-obvious, which is, what makes getting along non-obvious?
Oh, good question. I had not prepped for this. I think in some ways it's actually quite obvious in that we expect to get along. I think what's non-obvious about it is how surprised we are when it doesn't happen. Like, I think we're often so taken aback by the idea that our relationships at work fracture or are tense or don't, because we do just presume, well, why can't we just get along? Why can't things be okay? And then when we're blindsided by, that pessimist, the passive aggressive peer, the insecure boss, we feel totally, feel like the rug has been pulled out from under us, and we feel at a loss for what to do. So I think the non-obvious part is that I really want to normalize that these relationships are everywhere. You are not going to avoid them. And oftentimes you have to counter your own instincts, natural instincts around how to deal with them in order to address them in a satisfactory and hopefully successful way.
That is a fantastic place to close. We have been talking with Amy Gallo, contributor to Harvard Business Review, author of this amazing book called Getting Along. Thank you so much for joining me and being part of the Non-Obvious Book Review.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work you do to get the word out about great books. It's just, you're doing a service for the world, and I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.